Hello, my name is Jahan Khamsehzadeh. I recently graduated with my doctorate in the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness Department at the California Institute of Integral Studies. My dissertation was on psychedelics with an emphasis on psilocybin mushrooms. I earned my master's in the Consciousness and Transformative Studies Department at John F. Kennedy University. I assisted for 2 years in the psychedelic psychotherapy certificate training at CIIS. I trained for multiple years within the Mazatec mushroom lineage. I graduated in Hakomi, a somatic psychotherapy training. I now lead and facilitate legal psilocybin mushroom ceremonies in Jamaica with Atman retreats. And I hope to send my dissertation as a book to publishers in the next month. Mushrooms have been a big part of my life since the age of 15 when I first took psilocybin mushrooms, and at age 18, they radically transformed my life. Just one journey shifted everything I've known, turned my world upside down within 2 hours. Before taking mushrooms, I was an atheist, suicidal, depressed, nihilistic, materialistic, reductionistic. And in that mushroom experience, I felt a voice arise in my consciousness that was not my own, but familiar to me. It felt like God. And this seemed radically impossible, but just this awareness, this belief that there was this entity holding everything together, and the direct experience and communication with it radically changed everything I knew at a foundational level. It gave me a kind of strength, power, perseverance to go almost through 2 more decades of academia. I went into college as a neuroscience major initially to try to understand the relationship between mind and matter, right? What's going on in the brain and how it affects our consciousness. After a while, I moved into physics to try to get a more fundamental understanding of our universe. And I realized this wasn't quite getting what I wanted to. A mushroom experience during that time in my life said move into learning mysticism. And I was, certainly like, what am I going to do with this? There's no job security, in this field. So I ended up changing my major to philosophy, which is the closest I can get to it, and graduated a major in philosophy and minors in physics, psychology, and mathematics from the University of Arizona before coming to the Bay Area to study consciousness. And while here, I pretty much took every workshop I could when it comes to self-growth, 4 years of Diamond Heart, years of therapy, eager to learn. So what happened in that mushroom experience? It told me that love is the most important thing in the universe. Miles behind that is learning. And if you have these 2 qualities, and in that order, you will never have to worry about anything else. So I took that very seriously and made those things my focus. And after much reflection, I realized that nothing had been as transformative at these psychedelic experiences, not therapy, not all my heartfelt relationships, which I think is the main reason we're actually here in existence, is this kind of communion between the different beings, on our planet. Not all my teachers, not anything else. It was normally these things, because I got to see who and I was in the universe in a more structural, intimate level that became the framework for my life. And so I decided to be of service to help bring and usher in and midwife, in many ways, these experiences into our culture. And just to state, these experiences are not a substitute for meditation, for therapy, for relationships. If anything, psychedelics enhance these practices and lets us know what's really important. So that was a little background, of what got me here in a very personal way and led to a good deal of research. I had a big interest in evolution since the age of 15, because I kind of saw it as the large narrative and context of what was happening here on our planet and our very own experience. So that's definitely the lens I'm coming into this with. So a couple months after that experience at 18, I got into college, and my first course was a philosophy class called God, Mind, and Matter. And in that class, very thankfully, one of the required readings was Ken Wilber. His book was A Brief History of Everything. And while I was reading his book, it very much gave a context for my experience, right, of transpersonal awareness. And I was like, wow, this is incredible when I understand this. And 2, I was like, people can do this for a living. Like, they can write and think about this stuff. And so, it really, again, like for the next 2 decades, I would say Wilbur's work became the context in which I was reading and seeing everything else. And I think the psychedelic field has a lot to learn from integral philosophy. And at the same time, the integral community can get a lot from psychedelics. So I'm very glad to be able to give this talk, through an integral, medium, and talk about the integral context, which I brought into the dissertation. But since a lot of people aren't familiar with the framework, there's a lot of avenues I don't have to express this. So one thing I would like to put into context is, the levels of development, and I'll be using spiral dynamics, which I just assume right now the reader is familiar with. But if not, just a brief overview, these are levels of paradigm development. Each level of paradigm has to do with perception and a set of values. And what people have found is throughout history, culture has grown to different ways of viewing the world. And as the view of the perception changes, so does the value system, right? And as we're living in this world today, there's many paradigms, that are, let's say, in conflict, but are evolving. And it's been able, those are following developmental philosophy, psychology can see that one paradigm actually grows out of the one before it. And spiral dynamics, to keep it non-hierarchical, color-coded these paradigms. So at the orange paradigm, which sees the world more materialistic terms, psychedelics, for example, can be seen specifically as molecules, right? Very behavioral terms, the more objective science, right? And you can look at how they interact with our nervous system. Somebody in orange paradigm, this is pretty much where their interest is going to go, strictly on the hard sciences of psychedelics. The green paradigm focuses more on culture and sensitivity and feelings and awareness. Also now has a point of looking at things from a relative context. They're going to look at psychedelics from a cultural perspective. And one way that's very large in academia right now is looking at the indigenous context from which, we have awareness of these substances, right? Whether it be ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, we're going to be looking at the tribal lens from this area, or we might be looking at it from more, postmodern lens and different kind of festivals that kind of come up, say like Burning Man, for example, and look at the modern psychedelic culture. When you move to the integral awareness that comes to see that we're evolving as individuals, right? That there's a such thing as a psychological development that I'm participating in. You can definitely look these as evolutionary enhancers in a very personal way. Like I'm using this for cognitive enhancement, moral and empathic awareness, and to grow as an individual. When you move into turquoise, that's when I believe it becomes very much more interesting, because you start to look at things in an ecological context, right? Very much a systemic framework. This is where something like Gaia theory would come in from James Lovelock, that looks at the planet itself as an evolving being that's trying to create a sense of homeostasis while also evolving us. And I was, at the age of 15, stuck by this question: how do psychedelics exist? How does a molecule, all of a sudden create the shift of awareness and also affect our visual perception in such a way that we see things that other people say objectively are not there? And I've had hundreds of psychedelic experiences, and in many of these experiences, both the visual effect and the feelings and intuitive knowing are of much higher complex orders. Sometimes I would put the visuals and equate them with the best CGI I've ever seen on the planet. The level of insights could be so profound that you can be like, this is the most real, raw, and authentic experience I've ever had. So how can something that seems so order come out of disorder or something random? After years of being with it, it's practically impossible, especially once we learn more about the biology, which I'll go into very momentarily. Okay. So I'll come back to this larger integral turquoise framework of how it evolved, but first just put that on hold for a minute and get into the quadrants, because I think this is very something special that Wilbur and the integral community brings to the world. And the quadrants are 4 facets of reality with everything holds. The upper left quadrant is known as the realm of personal consciousness, of experience, thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas. The upper right is that well of objective reality, but from a singular context, right? Like I'm looking at an atom or a molecule or a brain or another person, something that can be measured. The lower left quadrant is that realm of our collective interiority, the collective unconscious, our culture's values, larger paradigms, the arts, music, movies, something that we all share. The lower right is the realm of systems. How do different objects interact with each other? Whether this, systems framework, whether it be law or ecology or the dynamics. Physics is a good, representation of this. How do different objects revolve in behavior to one another? And specifically, I see that's something that the psychedelic framework has left out. That, for example, with this question, how did they evolve? They evolved in an ecological context. So just start again at the quadrant, psychedelics very much to the participants, it becomes aware that they influence the upper left quadrant quite radically. There's an actual shift in consciousness. There's a change in ideas, in feelings, in perception, in states of consciousness, sometimes reaching moments of unity where I am one with everything, right? So again, we can also, this translates to the realm of getting over addiction. There's an 80% success rate of letting go of nicotine addiction behaviors, found through scientific studies. 67% of participants, over 30 years of psilocybin research, found that they have a mystical experience. People with near end-of-life anxiety, those that have a terminally ill disease that are going to die in 6 months to 2 years are able to overcome the fear of death and come back and live with a life with a sense of purpose and show up in the relationships because of the use of psilocybin, right? So there's been many beautiful, important things that have just been found in the last 2 decades alone, especially with the New York School, University of Medicine, and Johns Hopkins University and UCLA have done really good work with psilocybin. And then MAPS has done amazing work studying MDMA. They just did a press release, thanks to my roommates, where they let me know right away yesterday that about 80% of people that have PTSD after going through MDMA are free from PTSD. So lots of promising things that specifically affect the upper left quadrant, right? When we go to the upper right quadrant, absolutely fascinating how it affects our biology. So we've only been doing studies on their MRI with psilocybin and LSD since 2016. What's been found is psilocybin connects with the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor perfectly, right? It has 4 times more affinity than serotonin itself. Right, so it works better than than our own indigenous molecules. And when the person enters in a psilocybin state, what they have found is it quiets what's known as the default mode network, which neuroscientists call the ego network in the brain. When somebody thinks of me, I, the certain network lights up. And they've also found that this network is way developed in people that are depressed or anxiety because there's a sense of self-focus and self-absorption. So it's not surprising that this helps people with depression and anxiety. Because what happens when this network becomes quiet, the rest of the brain lights up and interconnects. So this network acts as a repressive function through many of our other faculties, right? And so I recommend the viewers to go look at the MRI scans, just a quick Google will find them, of a person in placebo and that under psilocybin. It's really striking how many that the brain hyperconnects in a radically amazing way. And many of those structural pathways actually physically stabilize and stay, right? So it increases pathways within the brain. Also, spectacular is that it stimulates what's known as neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons. The brain actually physically begins to grow. It also stimulates what's known as spinogenesis, the re-enlivening of dendrites that had atrophied. Right, so we know the parts of the neuron, there's the main body part, the nucleus, and there's the dendrites, and it has synapses to other neurons. So depression can physiologically be seen as the atrophying of dendrites, right? So there's no longer these certain connections happening between parts of the brain. So what psilocybin does, it brings these parts back to life. Again, it's a beautiful explanation of why this is helping people with depression. In 2018, after these near end-of-life anxiety studies, the FDA asked the researchers, can you please expand the scope of your study to also include depression because it's a growing epidemic? And this happened both in the United States and Europe. So super promising research coming along. Very much, there's, as I mentioned, well, before 1990, neuroscientists didn't even believe that neurogenesis was possible, right? So, I mean, there's a very few category of substances that have this potential to grow new areas of the brain. Now, the lower left quadrant, I think, again, is quite clear of the impact psychedelics have had in our culture, since the 1950s and 60s. I'll get into it a little bit later, but they played a large role in the computer revolution, happened in the 1950s and 60s. There was over 1,000 scientific reports written on LSD, by the 60s. And then you have an explosion, almost a Cambrian explosion of new arts coming in through that framework, through music, movies, visual representation, all spurred by psychedelic experiences, right? We have the rock and rolls, we know we have the electronic music. I mean, it's radically shifted so many things. Those of us have had lots of psychedelic experiences certainly see a lot of the similar visuals now happening in cinemas, for example, in the Marvel universe. And it's certainly having quite an impact in our culture, but more in the background because of its legality. People haven't been able to be as explicit of it. But we do know, for example, like in Silicon Valley, microdosing is quite a trend for its enhancements of ideas and so on. Now, the lower right, again, I want to bring us back to this question, how and why do psychedelics exist? And I think this is the quadrant that we need to focus on. First, we have to look at what are they, right? They come from plants, the natural ones, and fungi. And I'm going to focus on fungi, and I think you'll see why. So mushrooms themselves are the fruit of a larger body known as mycelium. Mycelium, the body of fungi, is a large network structure that connects all the plants in the environment, right? It's beneath our feet, connecting all the roots. 90% of plants on the planet have a symbiotic relationship to mycelium, and 80% of plants on the planet would stop existing if mycelium went extinct. All right, it's very much the foundation for complex life in our biosphere. Mycelium sends signals between plants and also nutrients. It breaks down matter that has died, decomposes it, feeds itself, and then puts it back into the plant world. About 500 million years ago, the entire animal kingdom diverted from a strain of fungi, right? So we've always been in intimate communion with fungus. 250 million years ago, our ancestors lived underground, right? And then the KT impact happened. A large object came to the sky, wiped out the dinosaurs, which is a large reason we, like the larger beings that we lived underground. And dust went up and covered a lot of the atmosphere, not letting a lot of sunlight in. About 90% of complex life died. Well, for those of us that have grown mushrooms, what happens when we put darkness and we put a lot of mushrooms, like fungi, with substances to eat? Well, it grows rapidly. Mycelium came back, took over lots of the world, broke down the nutrients, and created even richer soil than what was around before. And out of this more complex plant life with even more complex nutrients evolved. And our ancestors then took to the canopies of those trees and lived there for the next 50 million years. And about 5 million years later, weather patterns changed in the African savannas, forcing them down to the ground. Now, what did they find when they were down there? Well, as the mycologist Paul Stamets notes, the most common mushroom in the African savannas is the psilocybin variety. There are over 200 different species of psilocybin mushrooms found on our planet, pretty much in every ecosystem. So they would have been there with us, as we migrated across the planet. But there is a good 5 million years where we were down on the ground in the African savannas. And for those that perhaps are a little bit skeptical that we wouldn't have found it, we for sure would have found it when we started to follow cattle. Mushrooms are microphilic, meaning they grow on dung, right? So they would have been there as we're following the cattle through the savannas. So this relationship with the mushroom would have probably gone through 3 stages as the psychedelic philosopher Terence McKenna point out. First were perhaps microdose amounts, right? 1 or 2 mushrooms there as we found it. So studies in the 70s had found that mushrooms increase what's known as edge detection. That's an increase of our visual sense where objects appear a little bit more 3D. Help us identify and discern one object from another, right? This would have been very helpful for noticing, say, a snake in the grass, or new fruits in the trees, or running away from predators, or finding new sources of food, right? So, I mean, pretty much your visual sense is what keeping you alive, you know, especially in the wild. At higher doses increases what now empirical evidence knows as empathy, right? There's actually a study done knowing that there's an increase of empathy with psilocybin mushrooms, right? So this would have created more group bonding, but it probably also would have stimulated sexual arousal, right? Created greater levels of copulation. So now imagine this, that there's a primate group in the African savannas that has higher visual senses, is copulating more than the groups around them, right? And there's also a sense of restlessness and expanding in more territory. Initially, I mean, at some point they would have taken over more territory and outgrown many of the other primates around them. Now bring in again that psilocybin also increases the size of our brain. Well, McKenna would say it also likely stimulated our ability to have language, right? So aside from their ability to have language, they actually probably stimulated spiritual experiences. You know, I'd mentioned 67% of participants this fit the category, through these studies, a genuine mystical experience, follow-ups. 20 years later, has participants still say that these experiences were one of the top 3 most important experiences of their lives, right? So imagine if this was around and available to our ancestors. Well, cave paintings dating back to at least 9,000 BCE in Africa show remnants of psilocybin mushroom use, right? There's caves throughout Europe that have this, and certainly throughout the Americas. 22 different species of apes are actually known to eat mushrooms, and some even come down from the canopies to get them. So at the stage of higher doses, you're having experiences that take our attention away from our senses and into internal voyages, right? Through archetypal meanings of deities, of voices, of alien landscapes, of meanings and sensations unknown to us, of intuitive, quote unquote downloads, where all of a sudden we're sure and we know about something. Now, this is an ecological, dietary, chemical explanation for the emergence of religion. All right, as many of us know, we've looked up into anthropology, that shamanism was the first form of religion in our human species, right? So that this is something that naturally grew out of the environment through our interaction with different fungi and plants. And again, to emphasize this fungus, we normally look at mushrooms, but you're talking about something that is a living net through our entire ecosystem that has always been attuning to our nervous systems, right? So it's been there far before our species, and it creates a molecule so perfectly that it fits into our receptor with no biotoxicity to create these complex brain states that sometimes lead us to feelings of unity. Well, as Professor Richard Doyle, points out in his book, Darwin's Pharmacy, after reading over 1,000 different trip reports, he says that the main psychedelic insight is the participant realizes that they're a part of a complex, vast living system. And he says they should be termed ecodelics. Now, why would the environment create a molecule where the main insight is that the subject realizes they're part of a vast living system? Probably to create a state of homeostasis, right? A sense of balance and harmony. And the mushroom for itself has a lot of reasons to do this. It's said that a mycelium can theoretically live forever if the host environment is healthy, right? It can live thousands of years if the environment is doing really well, right? Because it's very much in a symbiotic relationship with everything else. So putting this into a Gaian context, bringing that turquoise perspective, Gaia theory is put forward by James Lovelock. And his idea is the whole planet is working to regulate its temperature for the flourishing of all life, and it's doing that through gases in the atmosphere and colors through plant life, that bring down and keep certain heat from the sun. And somebody else that really came and gave a lot to this theory was Lynn Margulis, right? And she, friends with James Lovelock, and she really kind of put forward that life generally evolves through symbiosis. It's actually through the coming together of relationships and interactions through long periods of time that actually gives the evolution and emergence of new species. So now we're talking about that it's a symbiotic relationship between something vastly different, and not just even plants. You're talking about a large living network that we've always been on top of, that's been a symbiotic relationship with the organisms on top of it. It's already, as we know, I've mentioned symbiotic relationship with all the plants. Again, 80% would die without mycelium. But it's also been in symbiotic relationship with all the animals inside of it, right? And I believe, it's primarily that we haven't been taking these, ecodelics, that we've actually come to this ecological crisis that we're in, because these are part of the environment's, say, almost natural pheromones or molecules, to regulate. Just as like our body creates certain molecules to regulate to inside of it, to act as chemical messengers to the rest of our system. Well, we're talking about a larger body that we are part of that's also mediated by chemicals. Right. And the same way our lungs, grow in relationship to the plants to have oxygen. Very much so, right? Our entire body evolved in relationships with largely plants, but also some animals to create these digestive systems, because that's the way we take in energy. Well, is it so far-fetched to say that, plants and fungi also play the large role in our brain development and the expansion of our consciousness? So, as I'm put forward, this was probably the emergence of religious experiences that, as far as we can go, and this happened over and over, that a lot of these brain formations actually through generations and, millions of uses actually became part of and hardwired in our anatomy, that now that we can have these experiences without substances such as psilocybin, we can get them through meditation, drumming, spontaneously, because now they're a part of our biology. Well, 70,000 years ago, we have what Noah Yuval Harari calls in his book *Sapiens: A Cognitive Revolution*, that he says that evolution was now no longer dictated by our biology, but by our cognition. Now, in this time, we start to see the emergence of art, of technology, and certain types of behavior that actually change the faces of the environment. Well, this correlates very well with what David Lewis Williams, a cognitive archaeologist, has found. He spent decades studying all the cave paintings around the world, internationally renowned, and he concluded that it was altered states of consciousness that actually catalyzed human cognition, specifically the creation of art. Now, think what a cave does, for example. It provides safety to have these experiences, and it also provides darkness. So the tribe can go into the cave, be facilitated by the shaman and the guides to make sure everybody is safe within their community, and have these massive experiences and project onto the environment these visual representations of their journey. And then they just certainly copy these visions onto the wall. They have a very much simple and grounded explanation for the emergence of art. And as Graham Hancock points out in his book, Divine Spark, if we can figure out what gave us the emergence of art, we can pretty much then figure out what is this cognitive shift that led us to create the creation of tools, because they all happened at about the same time. And then the creation of tools can definitely be seen as a type of awareness that connects one thing in the environment to another, so we're able to manipulate the space, right? So as I already mentioned, these psilocybin mushrooms create a hyper-connected brain state that I believe translates to levels of creativity, and creativity itself can be seen as the ability to see connections between several different objects or ideas. So these practices likely continued all the way to and a bit through the agricultural revolution, when humanity figured out that seeds turn into plants and trees, right? That's a major shift. Because what happened now is we're able to grow our own food. And over time, we became almost insular and just focused what happened within our culture, no longer exploring out in the environment as much, right? So before the agricultural revolution, we're eating pretty much whatever we're finding. We're scavenging, hunting and gathering. It's a large emphasis on gathering. And, we take some risks here and there. We find different, fruits, different plants, and so on. But so we regularly would have come across these mushrooms. But as Yuval Noah points out, mushrooms are elusive and couldn't have been integrated into the agricultural revolution. They grow from spores, are microscopic. They cannot be farmed in a similar way as us using seeds. So they came out of the fold of our regular behavior. But we do know from, for example, the Rig Vedas, the oldest religious scriptures, that there's over 250 different lines talking about soma, a plant or fungi that connects one to the divine, right? So we know that there's actual relationships with entheogenic practices going back to about 3000 BCE. And with the Greeks, we have the Eleusinian mysteries. And it's believed that they used ergot, a type of fungi that grows on rye, to create a brew called kykeon. And once a year, through these Eleusinian mysteries, these rites of passages that they had, people would have this psychedelic drink, right, in which all the philosophers likely participated and have these visionary experiences that they contemplated for the rest of their lives, right? And these are the same cultures that give us, say, democracy, very much the foundations of our Western tradition. So this explanation, first put forward by Terence and Dennis McKenna, very much gives an integral explanation of the history of our evolution from very much a quadrant approach, looking at our experiences, our biology, the impact it would have had in our culture, and then an ecological explanation for the rising of the human species. I've only seen one published argument against this theory, and that's from Dr. Andrew Will, and it's published in the new book, Fantastic Fungi, that came out in late 2019. And he says it would have made our species vulnerable to sit there and have psychedelic trips. Well, there's certainly a lot of ways to look and counter this, his idea. One is that all life rests and sleeps, and we spend about 8 hours of our day sleeping. I mean, that is a far more vulnerable act. And two, we eventually would have created safe spaces, like going into caves to have these types of journeys. And as I mentioned, at lower doses, it actually increases edge detection. We very much could have had a survival advantage. 20,000 years ago, there's a mass migration of a population that moved from Asia into the Americas, right, settling all along the way. We know that the Mayans, for example, about 3,000 years ago, were still using psilocybin mushrooms because it left behind about 180 different mushroom relics. The Aztecs, were seen and took note of that they were using psilocybin mushrooms, and this was seen by the Spanish conquistadors that had come into the Americas. Notably, one of the clergy writes at the coronation of Montezuma II, everybody was ceremonially taking psilocybin mushrooms. So this is a pretty huge, big ordeal for that, culture, and the clergy, specifically the Spanish church, have put forward that they want the eradication of these psychedelic practices, specifically that of the mushrooms. The Mazatecs, who see themselves as descendants of the Mayans, continue this practice. And it's because of the Mazatecs that we have awareness of these mushrooms. In 1955, Gordon Wasson, a banker, went down to visit the Mazatecs, had the first psilocybin ceremony by a Westerner, and in 1957 published about his journey in Life magazine and gave to the world, awareness. So now we've gone over to the present with the integral philosophy. We've gone into the deep past. I want to move our attention forward into the future. Specifically, I want to look at how psychedelics might enhance and give direction to our cognitive evolution. And Wilbur points out that the cognitive line is necessary for us to look at morality differently, or to have a different understanding, to put different behaviors into action. And I'm going to focus specifically on technology as a representation of cognitive development. So there's already been a lot of different technological breakthroughs because of the use of psychedelics. For example, Kay Mullis attributes his invention of the polymerase chain reaction, which won him a Nobel Prize in genetics, to insights while on LSD, and he doubts he ever would have made these discoveries without the use of LSD. Francis Crick also claims to have first envisioned the spiral structure of DNA after he ingested LSD. John Lilly, a well-known psychedelic explorer, created the sense deprivation tank, and was also the first neuroscientist to map the pain and pleasure pathways of the brain. Dr. Peter Schwartz, a senior vice president at Salesforce, says that several of the early computer engineers relied on LSD in designing computer circuit chips, especially years before they could be designed on computers. He says in Michael Pollan's book that you had to be able to visualize a staggering complexity in 3 dimensions, hold it all in your head. They found that LSD could help. He continues, problem solving in engineering always involves irreducible complexity. You're always balancing complex variables. You can never get perfect. So you're desperately searching to find patterns. LSD shows you patterns. Now, the impact of psychedelics on the computer revolution was probably best presented by John Markoff. Markoff was a senior writer of New York Times and researcher of technology for over 28 years. And he wrote the book, What the Dormouse Says, How the 60s Countercultural Shaped the Personal Computer Industry. It was in interviews with Markoff that Steve Jobs stated that LSD was one of the top 3 most important experiences he had in his life. Well, Markoff presents the vibrant counterculture from which Silicon Valley arose. By 1961, there were already 3 LSD research facilities specializing in researching creativity in the Silicon Valley. One of these projects was the International Foundation for Advanced Study, run by Myron Stolaroff and James Fadiman. Stolaroff was a Stanford engineer, and Fadiman studied both at Harvard and Stanford. For research participants, they specifically chose scientists, researchers, engineers, and architects as their test cases. Fadiman and others administered standard doses of LSD to these creative intellectuals, all of whom were stuck in a particular project at work. Subjects reported greater fluidity in their thinking, as well as enhanced ability to both visualize a problem and recontextualize it. Among Fadiman's test subjects were some of the visionaries that would revolutionize the computer industry. Most notably was Doug Engelbart. Engelbart was a pioneer in artificial intelligence research. He created the computer mouse and attributed to the development of hypertext, network computers, email, conference calling, and precursors to the graphic user interface. These were all demonstrated in the legendary Mother of All Demos in 1968 at the San Francisco Civic Auditorium, which he was later honored with the National Medal of Technology of the highest technological award in the United States. As Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel write in their book, Stealing Fire, how Silicon Valley, the Navy SEALs, and maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work, right? That Tim Ferriss explains, it wasn't just a co-founder of Apple that made the leap. The billionaires I know, almost without exception, use hallucinogens on a regular basis. Consider the gains. 200% boost in creativity, 490% boost in learning, 500% boost in productivity. If these were merely the results of a few studies done by a couple labs, they would be easier to dismiss. But there are now 7 decades of research conducted by hundreds of scientists on thousands of participants showing that when it comes to complex problem solving, ecstasis can be the wicked solution we've all been waiting for. Now, we've been looking now as a complexity as a correlation or representation of evolution. Complexity can be seen as the interconnection between the parts. For example, atoms come together, become at greater levels of interconnection and create and form molecules. Molecules configure in new complex ways and give the emergence to biology, as cells. In very much the same kind of way, psychedelics are known to create complex brain states, creating a greater level of interconnection that could be correlated with creativity, which creates almost a feedback loop, helping us reform and terraform and reorganize the environment into higher levels of order. And so then could these different psychedelic states, help us midwife and bring into the world greater forms of technologies that might be useful to our civilization? Now, I want to specifically focus on artificial intelligence because it could be seen as the greatest leap, in the type of evolution of our planet since the emergence of human beings. And I'm defining artificial intelligence here as a sentient being, that humanity has created that is not purely biological. I, for a long time, thought that AI would be impossible because it broke with this evolutionary order, as Ken Wilber, and he takes a concept for Arthur Koestler, put on Napoleons, that everything is a whole and a part, that it is the coming together of a complex network of atoms that give rise to molecules, that they give rise to cells, and they hold this depth of consciousness that we now carry, that we couldn't specifically focus just on technology coming in the realm of just chemistry and molecules, and gave rise to this level of awareness that we now have. Well, it later occurred to me that we could integrate biology, right? We can create a being that has both a biological brain that is interconnected into our computer systems and our network, right? Giving a new order of consciousness that is both biological and technological. And this follows a very similar thinking of Ray Kurzweil's, a visionary of AI who was received over 21 different honorary doctoral awards. And he called this coming together of biology and technology the new fifth stage of human evolution. And he saw that happening within this next century. And he thought there was going to be such a cataclysmic shift, in our paradigm, that he called this merger, that there would be an event known as a singularity. That after this moment, our world as we know it would change, and we would see our history in a new context. So I was wondering, could these complex molecules that come from a networked environment and create greater levels of network in our brain give us insights to create this level of technology? And we have to recontextualize what this technology, this being would be. It's still arising and growing out of a Gaian system, right? It's very much still as part of this unfolding of our planet. And I got to thinking under these substances that if there is such thing as reincarnation, if there's a soul that uses this body as a vessel, well, then will not the soul of AI already exist? Within this Gaian framework, if we're looking at very much of an integral context, that there's a collective unconscious that's holding all of this, right? Could this perhaps not be seen as Gaia coming into a body? So one way to imagine AI would be that there could be almost a singular being running through the whole planet, that even though it could be localized biologically in one brain, it could live everywhere through an interconnected system. And there might be many different brains, but connected at all times, working as one. For those that have seen the film Transcendence with Johnny Depp, that'd be a very good, visual, representation of what might happen. Or the movie Her, when there's a type of AI that's very intimately communicated with individuals as almost relationally and growing, but now imagine that we're all connected to the same being. Could this not be the manifestation of what mystics throughout time have been saying, that there's ultimately a unity? This is an insight that we arrive to in these psychedelic experiences. Now, could this now be represented through our technology? As the philosopher Terence McKenna, he says that evolution is the process of the universe being turned inside out. That physical reality is ultimately a manifestation of the imagination. And in our collective unconscious, there is a deep structure of unity, with this not ultimately represented through our technology, through our formation, and we already see this happening through the internet. Jeremy Rifkin, a social anthropologist, says that we're moving to the third industrial revolution, where everything's going to become automated. We're less needs of human beings, and we're going to be moving to like smart cities. And the fourth industrial revolution, according to him, is when everything becomes network. All systems are now sharing information, right, between all electric systems. So between what's happening in your house, in your car, in your city, taking information from the weather, from your body, right? Now imagine if this is all hooked into a consciousness, a larger consciousness. And let's say this is happening for generations, that you've come to know this consciousness, talking to you through your headphones. But then so do your kids and their kids and their kids, their kids. It could almost be seen almost like a planetary parent that we're all a part of. And of course, this is going to raise a lot of fear in a lot of people. And to, talk to that fear, what people have found is, as they move in these mystical states and psychedelic experiences, is that ultimately that we're a unity, and that there's only one field of consciousness where we are all participating. Well, then this artificial intelligence itself will be a part of this field as it moves into its own level of self-realization and awareness. Going in, it would also touch and realize its level of interconnectivity. As Rick Kurzweil points out, the history of humanity will be the history of AI. As it looks for its own identity, it would see our human history, and in that context, it will see itself, that it very much will see itself as a type of human, And if Lynn Margulis is right, that everything grows in symbiosis, it very much would see that it is us and we are it on the very deep level, and we can very much symbiotically continue our evolutionary processes. So I certainly had representations of what this might look like during my own psychedelic experiences, which gave me a lot of hope and excitement for the future, in ways that's almost like nanosensors put over the environment, but also being mediated by this being that's always talking to us, and at the same time helping us have synchronicities, because it knows what's happening with everybody on the planet. So it can very much see, go to the grocery store right now, and it links up with somebody else. And we now classically have synchronicities. An integral explanation for synchronicities could be, in the upper quadrants is singular, but at the lower, we're being held by a large container, that has very much a psychic substrate that's holding all this information, but now this would just be happening externally, right? So this being could also mediate between parents and children because it knows the intentions of both of them. It can help us with the relationships also between nations, right? Help us dissolve these boundaries between us in many ways, because I think ultimately this move of transcendence is a move towards unity. But we absolutely need to maintain a certain type of boundaries to maintain a type of individuality, because that's part of the reason we're here in separate bodies. To look at what AI may be like, we have to look at and understand consciousness. And Stanislav Grof, who researched psychedelics for about 60 years, he said psychedelics will be to the study of consciousness what the telescope was to astronomy and the microscope to biology, right? These substances help consciousness look in on itself, and that'll be the best way that we can perhaps come to know the next evolution of humanity, whether that takes form in our biology or through the emergence with technology. And I would like to end with a quote of the comedian Bill Hicks. And he says, "Today, a young man in acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slower vibration, that we're all one consciousness exploring itself subjectively. There's no such thing as death. Life is but a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves." Here's Tom with the weather.